The Fox News decision desk can now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States.
It is now official. CNN projects that Donald Trump has been elected president, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris and making a political comeback unlike any in modern American politics. Now, we can make this projection now.
The return of Donald Trump to the White House follows an extraordinary campaign that defied expectations and raises profound questions about the state of American democracy. His victory, despite ongoing legal challenges and investigations, including his role in efforts to overturn the 2020 election, marks one of the most contentious comebacks in US political history. So what does Trump's win mean for American democracy, civil resistance, and global trends in governance? Today, I am joined by Harvard University professor Erica Chenoweth, here in Oslo to deliver PRIO's annual peace address, along with PRIO research professor Scott Gates and research director Marianne Dahl. I am Arnaud Siad, and this is PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Erica, Marianne, Scott, welcome to this episode. We are recording exactly a week after the election has been called for Donald J. Trump. Back in 2016, Donald Trump had won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. This time, however, roughly 3 million more Americans voted for him compared to Kamala Harris. So let me start by asking the two Americans in the studio with us today, what did you make of those results? Were you surprised, Erica?
I was not surprised. I've been expecting this outcome for a few years. I think that there were a couple of very difficult issues to overcome. The first is the incumbency of Joe Biden, which was kind of deeply unpopular and had been for a few years, that his approval ratings just haven't been able to improve since the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021. And they stayed low throughout his presidency. We were dealing with significant economic headwinds, as is true everywhere in the world. And, basically everywhere in the world where there was an election this year, as far as I understand it, incumbents lost vote share. Not all of them lost elections, but they all lost vote share for the first time in the history of the world. So we're dealing with something systemic that's beyond just the United States, and I think that's very important. The second reason I wasn't surprised is simply because every election in the United States is really down to turnout. And turnout is something that's deeply related to enthusiasm. And we've known that there is and has been deep enthusiasm for Trump's candidacy all along. And we knew that there was a major enthusiasm gap that needed to be closed by the Harris campaign. She didn't have very much time to do that. And instead of looking like a repeat of 2020, this election was much more a repeat of 2016. The electoral map is virtually identical to 2016. The turnout was low on the Democratic side like it was in 2016. And so, I think that just shows, broader issues around the way these elections play out, the way our Electoral College focuses candidate activities in a few states rather than more broadly across the country. And, it's just sort of the way it went down.
Scott?
I'll just add, I agree with everything that Erica said. I will add part of the context, so the global context related to this anti-incumbency is related to the COVID pandemic and to subsequent inflation due to the fiscal policies adopted by most OECD countries. And even though in the US, in contrast to Europe, the inflation rate has gone down, especially in such an unequal society as the US, if you're having trouble making ends meet, you know the price difference from 4 years ago. And whether it's continuing to rise, that's immaterial. What you do is you realize that the price for a loaf of bread is twice as high as it used to be. That has a profound effect for people who are working at the Olive Garden on a weekend job to make extra money to make their budget. And if that's happening, there's going to be a lot of pent-up anger. And I think a receptive audience for a populist rhetoric. And that's exactly what Trump offers.
Scott, you're making the case that well-known figures of the American left, like Senator Bernie Sanders, have been making for a while, which is that the Democrats have neglected to address the plight of struggling Americans, those living paycheck to paycheck. And in fact, in the last weeks of the election, Kamala Harris' team really focused their message on Donald Trump as a threat to U.S. democracy.
This is not a candidate for president who is thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who is unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power.
And she would often remind crowds at her rallies of some of the more egregious things about her opponent, that he would be the first convicted felon to be elected into the White House, that he still has multiple criminal cases pending, including charges for attempting to overturn the 2020 election, 2 impeachments, including one on a charge of incitement of insurrection on January 6th when the Capitol was stormed by a mob. And yet, Scott, this did not deter a majority of American voters to vote for Donald Trump. So why was saving American democracy not the voter magnet Democrats had hoped?
I think that the Republicans had an effective counter to that. They blamed the Democrats as engaging in electoral lawfare, as they called it. And if you have a tendency to believe it or be only focused on your personal background, you didn't worry about that. And then the previous regime, Trump was effective in ruining things. The nuclear arms agreement with Iran, the Pacific Free Trade Agreement, for example, the climate agreement. Those are easy things for a president to do because you can engage in executive action. But anytime he had to use Congress, the only time he was effective was a tax cut. He tried to repeal what's called Obamacare, or the health care reform. He failed. He tried a number of other things and he failed. And I think for the public that's more politically aware and still voted for Trump, and I will paraphrase that I think many of the people who voted for Trump are not that politically engaged. They don't really think there will be an undercutting of democracy. They actually do have an open mind to think that the system is corrupt and that the legal system is manipulated for partisan reasons. If you have an anti-elite attitude, a general distrust in authority, then the Republican message, which is a populist nationalist message, it's going to fall on receptive ears, and they're just not going to believe the messages that are coming from the Democrats, nor from the Republicans who were opposed to Trump. And I think that's an important note, is half of Trump's cabinet was not supporting him. Arch conservatives, but not populists, like the Cheneys, the former vice president, and the congresswoman, both were vehemently opposed. And Liz Cheney was campaigning with Harris. But that section of Republicans had already abandoned Trump. I don't think there was any significant population that was going to be moved. They've already been moved away from the Republicans.
Erica?
Yeah, I agree with everything Scott said. I would add 2 things to it. The first is that there was a study done by Joe Goldman and Lee Druckmann where they were trying to gauge what the sort of distribution of the population in the U.S. was of like true Democrats, meaning small d Democrats, and true authoritarians, and then everyone in between. And they found that there's a roughly equal share of true authoritarians and true Democrats in the United States, meaning people that are kind of not particularly partisan, but have underlying values that kind of either reinforce or clash with those commitments. And then others will express, democratic values until they're put up against partisan conflict, in which case they retreat to their partisan kind of corner. And so there are a lot of, you might call soft Democrats, small d Democrats in the United States. And so that's just an issue when you're trying to frame the outcome of an election around the threat to democracy, which is that you only have a very limited number of people who are truly motivated by that issue. Now, there were many people who said that the future of American democracy was one of the main reasons they voted for either Harris or for Trump. And so that, displays the underlying kind of conflict or disagreement about the sources of the threat to American democracy. But one note about this is just that, many supporters of Trump saw the sort of legal cases against him and the mounting legal cases, both federal and state, as evidence of his persecution. And interestingly, as soon as 2022, you started to see unaffiliated voters and independents, which actually are the largest voting bloc in the United States, start to be very sympathetic to that set of arguments that actually, it's not right, it's not democratic to persecute a former political opponent who has lost and is no longer in office, is not the incumbent. They were sort of sold on this idea that there was this pile-on that was illegitimate. And again, with Biden's low approval rating and then that victim narrative that started to really take hold, the argument that he's a threat to democracy was really falling on deaf ears in many parts of the country. People wanted somebody to say, I know your wages have not gone up in 4 years. Like whether inflation is going down or up, I know you're earning the same as you did 4 years ago, and you shouldn't. That's not right. And I'm going to make you more money. That's what they wanted somebody to say, and that's what he tried to put across.
So you and Scott are making the point that it's the economy, stupid, the famous phrase coined by James Carville in 1992, and that Trump's series of legal troubles was seen by many as politically motivated. And yet, during the campaign, Donald Trump really played with the accusations that he's a threat to democracy. In fact, let me play a soundbite from the man himself. Here's what he said at a town hall with Fox News host Sean Hannity in December 2023.
Under no circumstances, you are promising America tonight, you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one.
Except
Look,
for?
he's going crazy. Except for day one.
Meaning?
I want to close the border, and I want to drill.
That's
drill,
not that's
drill.
That's not.
No, no.
That's not retribution.
I'm going to be. He keeps. We love this guy. He says, "You're not going to be a dictator, are you?" I said, "No. Other than day one, we're closing the border, and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator."
So
okay?
that sounds to me like you're going back to the policy.
Erica, how seriously should we take such statements from him? Do you believe that there is a genuine risk to the checks and balances that uphold American democracy, or are such concerns exaggerated?
I think there's always a genuine threat. So, I'm very convinced by my colleagues Dan Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky's book about how democracies die. And in it, what they say is that, we've gotten into dangerous complacency and trusting that our institutions are the primary source of checks and balances, where actually it's norms of self-restraint, particularly by executives. That is primarily how democracy works. And when executives begin to shred those norms or directly criticize them or overreach, then there are significant threats to democracy. I would say I don't put too much in kind of one soundbite. I'm more worried about some of the broader plans that have already been talked about with regard to applying loyalty tests to civil servants, doing like a big purge of the civil service, which not only is, again, directly contradicting our norms democratically, but also would empty the government of the sources of institutional knowledge and continuity and expertise that we need to deliver for the many problems that we have in public policies. So there's sort of a disdain for competency as well as the potential for kind of partisan disloyalty or suspected disloyalty based on partisan affiliation. The other major issue right now is that there isn't a separation of powers in the country, or it looks like there won't be. The House of Representatives also has a majority of Republican elected officials. And so what that will mean is we'll have a trifecta, a supermajority in the Supreme Court, which has already proved to be the farthest right court in generations. We will have both the Senate and the House, and the House is so important because that's the power of the purse, aligned with the president, and cabinet members who are selected primarily on the basis of loyalty and deference, as opposed to competence and sort of a team of rivals that helps the president check his own assumptions and understandings and make the right call for the American people. So I worry more that not just are the norms degraded significantly in our country already, but also that the institutional checks and balances, which ordinarily might help to protect that, are not going to be present. I mean, the biggest institutional check that we have available to us in the United States is federalism at this point, meaning that there are, the states have typically had extraordinary power to govern themselves in the United States in many areas. And I think the only real remaining concern or question about that is how much that will remain true, given the serious policy ambitions that the president-elect has committed to.
Scott?
I think Trump by himself and the single soundbite that you played for us that's partly just Trump's game. But the real fact of the matter is the Republican Party is Trump's party. They don't even have a platform anymore. They're just saying whatever Trump wants. That's never occurred in U.S. politics before, ever. And the Republicans who've come in and replaced the old ones, the Trumpites, don't exhibit the policies of traditional republicanism. They're opposed to free trade. They are anti-alliance. Maybe there were wings about, the first America First movement of isolationism and things like that.
Marianne, I'm glad to have you with us today to try and understand a bit more about the state of democracy around the world and what people make of it. But before we look at some other places, let's stick to the US. I want to bring up a poll done by the New York Times, Siena College, on the eve of the election, in which 45% of American voters believe that democracy in the US does not do a good job representing ordinary people, and that 76% of voters thought American democracy was currently under threat. So, Marianne, should we read into this that people are deeply dissatisfied with politics and their government, or the democratic system of governance itself?
Okay, so that's a great question, Arnaud, and it's really difficult to disentangle the two, whether people are unhappy with current politicians and politics, or whether they are unhappy with the system, so democracy in itself, partly because they tend to feed into each other. So it's a Zambian president who said you cannot eat democracy. So we all support democracy and freedoms, and it's really important for our lives. But democracies also need to deliver. So it goes back to what Scott was saying, that when it's difficult for people to make ends meet, it's also unlikely that the government is going to be popular. So when people struggle to get enough food, to get a roof above their head, and all of this, it's likely they're first going to be unhappy with the policies and the politicians. And that in the short term is not a problem for democracy. It's when this becomes a long-term problem that we're likely to see people less convinced by the system. So normally in a democracy, when the government becomes unpopular, it's supposed to make people vote differently. And you get a different government, which you have here. But it's also supposed to lead to very different policies. And so it was this one number I saw that Congress in the US tend to have approval rating of around 14%, yet the large majority tends to get re-elected, which suggests some sort of a hiccup in the system.
It's fascinating, that hiccup in the system you are mentioning. And I wonder if that hiccup is in fact part of the reason we are seeing a democratic backsliding around the world. According to the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, which tracks the health and number of democracies, the world has gone back to levels of democracy last seen in 1998. In other words, the number of democracies has shrunk in the last 2 decades. Marianne, in the United States and beyond, what do we know about people's commitment to democracy? Is it losing its shine as a model of governance?
Okay, so I'll start with the US and then I'll say something about the rest of the world. But so Robert Dahl in the 1960s said that you would have to work hard to find an American who didn't support democracy or who was supporting a different system. And partly that reflects that the 1960s were a completely different time. But it also reflects something about how we were measuring and asking people at democracy. So the classical way to ask about democracy has been like, is it important for you to live in a democracy? And this tends to yield results far up into the 90s in most countries, including in the US, but also including countries where we have seen democratic backsliding over the recent years, and where the incumbent has executed these democratic backsliding processes, but they tend to remain in power. They tend to retain their popularity. So this was somewhat puzzling and made people ask, are we not asking the right question? Because given how popular democracy seems to be in these countries, we shouldn't see these developments. So in a study conducted in the US in 2018, they went away from asking, is it important for you to live in a democracy? And rather wanted to check how willing people are to prioritize democracy. Are they going to punish candidates who have these anti-democratic statements? So the way they did this was that they first mapped people's political preferences. And then they set up this experiment where that person had to choose between a candidate with their own political preferences, but who also supported this anti-democratic platform. So, for example, they supported a bill where they were going to reduce the number of polling stations in areas that supported the other candidate. And then they wanted to see, and they had to choose between this candidate and another candidate with different political preferences compared to their own, but who didn't have this anti-democratic platform. And the number of people who were willing to punish the candidate for their anti-democratic statements was 10%, or a little bit above 10%. That's astonishing low compared to the 90 or even more % of people supporting democracy. And it creates this huge problem because we have been thinking that we had this high number of people who would be willing to protect democracy, and it turns out that it's much lower than we expected. And these kind of surveys have been tried out in European countries also. Not completely identical, but where the numbers are even a little bit lower, with maybe the highest numbers being seen in Sweden and in Poland at around 10% also.
And yet, Marianne, some of your research shows that the link between mass mobilization and democratic outcomes tends to weaken. In particular, you've written that we are seeing a sharp decline in the effect of mass mobilization on democracy after 2012. Talk to us a bit about that. And what happened after 2012? Are autocrats and dictators learning from these mass movements?
Yes, so it definitely seems to be the case. They seem to be much less surprised now by the movements today than they were previously. So it's this strong finding across political science, sociology, and economics, showing that when people take to the streets and protest non-violently, the likelihood of democratic change increases. So we were just noticing, like many, like Erica in her research, that there were few success stories over the last years. So we were wondering whether maybe this large and very robust finding in the literature was reflecting a very specific time period. And what we found was that it wasn't really before the beginning of the 1980s that mass mobilization had the power, increased the likelihood that we would see a democratic transition. And this effect became stronger up until the 1990s, before it started to decline. And it's from 2012, we don't really see an effect anymore. And we also see that, and this is different from any previous period, we see that these movements now, it's not only that they are not leading to democratic change, but they are also falling short of removing the incumbent. And that's new, which means that the sitting incumbents, when they are threatened by these broad-based mass mobilization movements, they are able to withstand these protests and continue to remain in power. So that's a huge, huge struggle. And it probably reflects that they are learning, but it also might say something about the movements themselves, that they look different today than they did before.
A threat to American democracy we haven't talked about yet is the election denial movement, the belief among many Republicans that elections in the US are rigged and stolen from them. The movement predates Donald Trump, but he amplified it and gave it more legitimacy with Stop the Steal rallies, etc. Election denialists have been quiet since the election has been called for Donald Trump. But is it safe to say this is not going away? Erica?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the degree to which that movement is mobilized is related to whether they feel like they're in power or not. So, Trump himself is like election denier number one. He invented the big lie of the election having been stolen from him in 2020. And so now he's going to be in power, so they can't complain. I don't think that there's any understanding that that movement is genuinely concerned about election integrity, except in the cases where they don't win.
Scott?
It's part of an anti-system, anti-elite orientation, or even you could say ideology. The system is rigged. I'm not doing well because the system's biased against me. All of these immigrants are taking jobs where they're collecting welfare payments, and they'll have it both ways in one sentence. But the system's out to get me, and elections, just like everything else, are part of that system that's biased and unfair. So I don't think it's going away in the near future. There will have to be a super charismatic individual who is more inclusive and not divisive for America to turn the corner. And it's possible. We've had those people before rise in American politics, but for my own reckoning, I don't have any person in mind who would truly be able to do that. There'll have to be somebody coming out of, quote, nowhere. And in general, that's where that happens. I mean, Erica made allusions to federalism, and to some extent, as long as that is preserved, there is the independent laboratories, you can say, where new things can emerge. And most innovation in the U.S. has actually come through those vehicles, for good or for bad. Trump is exceptional in that regard, that he was at the national level and came into the national, was able to take over the party. He did not use any state-level apparatus or anything, which in the past has been the major vehicle for an outsider kind of moving in on the party.
As we wrap this episode, we've spoken at length about the divisions in American society, and we heard from Kamala Harris and President Biden in their recent speeches, as well as now President-elect Trump, that the country must come together and unite behind a project for America. The question might seem disingenuous in light of what we have discussed so far, but are you hopeful at all that this could be somehow a unifying presidency, or are you resigned to the idea that the next 4 years will bring just more divisions in the country? Erica?
Well, I think there's some interesting insights from the last Trump administration. One is that some of the more kind of populist economic policies that he insisted upon are things that couldn't enter either the Democratic or the Republican parties before, but are now broadly popular and are even things that Biden himself adopted, like reinvestment in our infrastructure, industrial policy, investments, and things along those lines, as some of my colleagues have brought up at Harvard. So I think there were also many things that happened under the first Trump administration that were very damaging to the polity. But one of the things that is true is that there's been a new kind of consensus around what Americans prioritize, and that is a real renewal in the American economy and a broader sense that the shared prosperity is available to everyone as opposed to those just at the top. And so any contender who wants to seriously compete against Trump, either in basically gaining a new electoral majority in Congress or in flipping any of the red states into more contested territory, is going to have to articulate a very ambitious economic project in order to do that. And that's not something I think that the Democratic Party had really been forced to reckon with in recent years. So as an American, I certainly hope that the next 4 years is good for the country. But I have to admit my skepticism based on the proposals that have been put out. As Scott said, there's not a clear Republican platform, but there are hints at what the general project will be. And as far as I can tell, the general project is scapegoat a whole bunch of people who are already extremely vulnerable for the grievances of other Americans and violate all of our sense of decency and human rights in order to perform some kind of more narrow American identity and sense of nationhood. And that is deeply troubling to me. So I'm very worried that what they've already promised is more division and more damage. So, on the one hand, I do want to acknowledge where I think a new consensus has been shaped that might be good for more Americans than what we've had in the past. But I'm deeply worried about what the promised next 4 years is going to look like for the future of the country.
I'll add on the economic policies of Trump. In one area, he's been consistent, even when he was a Democrat, and that's his anti-free trade orientation. And he's declared a 20% universal tariff and maybe 50 or 100% tariff against Chinese imports in the U.S. What this is going to lead is going to be a trade war. The EU and Britain and Norway will have to respond with an equal tariff on American goods. The implications just within the U.S. will be extremely disturbing. It will contribute to inflation because there's an assumption that it'll be immediately a production of an American good that will replace it. But there's no one to manufacture that good. So then the consumers of that good will have to pay 20% more. That's going to contribute to inflation. It will probably lead to a recession. And I already talked about those who are supporting him are the people living on the edge. They're going to be the big losers here. The irony is those in the top 30% of income who are mostly voting for Democrats, they're not going to be hurt like the ones who are the majority supporting Trump. That creates an endless cycle, though, because then there'll always be somebody else who's causing the trouble.
Scott, Erica, Marianne, thank you very much. This episode was produced by Arnaud Siad and Nora Josephson and edited by Brage Pedersen, with sounds from Fox News and CNN. Find out more about PRIO's cutting-edge research, policy briefs, and events on PRIO.org.